from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
It is our pleasure to start a 12-week series today with you. Based upon several gifts and grants, we are very fortunate to be able to bring you really a 3-month series. The topic of this program throughout this process is going to be Journey Through Time, Conversations with the World's Great Women and Men. We've been very fortunate to find scholars and presenters from around the United States to come and be with us at North Idaho College to deal with this very fascinating topic. Most of our guests are going to be role-playing some famous person in history, so the context in which you will view this program will be in the past, and we will be using that as our kickoff point throughout the process. I must thank the associated students at North Idaho College, the North Idaho College Foundation, the Idaho Humanities Council, and the Citizens Council for the Arts for very generous grants that has made this series possible. We also have a special set to do this program in a historical setting, and I would like to thank two contributors to that set. First of all is the Sherman Antiques and Collectibles in Coeur d'Alene, owned by Doyle and Sharon Francis, and also Mr. Grant Smith on the staff of KSPS Channel 7 in Spokane. On our first program, we would like to come to you with something entitled A Conversation about the Greek and Roman philosophers and their effect upon the founding fathers of the United States. In order to do that, we're very fortunate to have an expert with us. I will first introduce the individual who is responsible for some exciting work in this field. I welcome to the program Dr. Carl J. Richard, who is a professor of history at the University of Southwestern Louisiana. Our guest holds a PhD degree from Vanderbilt University, and his book has been acclaimed across the United States that's entitled The Founders and the Classics, Greece, Rome, and the American Enlightenment, published by Harvard University Press. In looking at that book and reading some of the reviews, Lance Banning, who is the author of The Jeffersonian Persuasion, had this to say about our guest's book. He is very, very precise in saying that Dr. Richard argues two important points about this subject. First of all, that classical influences were determinative, not just illustrative, of the founders' thought. And number two, that the influence of the classics did not fade during the first years of the new republic known as the United States. Now, with that background, I would like to invite you to view and watch as Dr. Richard plays the role of a headmaster known as Nathan Tisdale. And so we get in the right mode for this program and the others. Headmaster Tisdale, welcome to the program, and we have some exciting things to ask you. Now, as I indicated from that introduction, would you share with us as students under your direction, and you've been a headmaster for many years, why you believe that George Washington, John Adams, and Jefferson and others were very, very much influenced by the classical writers and philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle and Cicero?
Well, each of these founding fathers of our great nation underwent the grammar school and in some cases also the college process of training in the classics. As you know, the grammar school, in the term grammar school, grammar refers to Greek and Latin grammar, not to English grammar. In fact, it's only been since the American Revolution that English grammar has been added to Greek and Latin grammar. And personally, I think it's an appalling degradation of standards. That this is English is kid stuff. You learn that from your mother. You come to an academy to be trained in the two most important languages in history, that of the Greeks and the Romans. As I said, most of the founding fathers underwent this very rigorous process of training in Greek and Latin. Washington was somewhat of an exception in that his father died when he was 11, and this ended his formal education. Nevertheless, even Washington was heavily influenced through his surrogate family, the Fairfaxes, and admiring and emulating the great Roman heroes, in particular the Stoic martyrs such as Cicero and Cato, and of course the mythical Roman hero Cincinnatus, who was one of Washington's great models. So I think that all of them found various things in the classics. They found personal models to emulate, but they also found philosophies, theories that they incorporated into the Constitution, and thus shaped this wonderful republic in which we live.
As the headmaster, Mr. Tisdale, and playing this role, I introduced to you Steve Schenk, who's going to join me and question you concerning this connection between the Greek and Romans and the Americans. Steve Schenk.
Headmaster Tisdale, I wonder if you could sort of fill out the picture that you started to paint of what your students, and this would of course be in the latter part of the 1700s, 18th century, what they would have studied, what they are studying then, and of course what in the earlier part of that century when Jefferson, Washington, Adams were young men, what was their education like?
Well, the educational system that we know here in the late 18th century really is of medieval origin, and it has really been the system in all the great countries in the West, both Protestant and Catholic, and it has changed very little throughout the centuries because there's just a great consensus about what it is that people should know. The students generally begin their training somewhere between 6 to 8 years old, and each day they go from about 8 to 11, then a break, and then from 1 in the afternoon until dark. And they begin the process by memorizing the rules of Latin grammar contained in the manual written by Marthurius Corderius. And once they have memorized the rules of Latin grammar, then they begin in some elementary works, and then proceed to the more important authors, Cicero, Horace, and so on. And it's a very arduous process. Each passage that they translate, they must first speak out that translation, then they must write it out, and then finally they must translate that English back into Latin in a different tense. This is to make sure that they have a firm command of each passage that they translate. And this process of learning Latin really takes years, and only at the end of that do they learn Greek and go through the same process with Greek. Latin, I must say, has the primacy. Greek is considered secondary attainment, an important attainment, but secondary to Latin.
What other subjects do your students study? Other languages? French, perhaps? Or
in some cases, they do meet with classical authors in other areas of study. For instance, in their rhetorical and logical training, they study Aristotle. In their mathematical training, they study Euclid, and so on. So they really encounter the ancients in just about everything that they study. Of course, they do study some as I said, mathematics, but some science. And as I said, since the Revolutionary War, English has been added, although some Latin masters find this to be insulting, that they are asked to teach English, which they think that their children should learn from their mothers and not from distinguished scholars such as themselves, so that the amount of English which is actually taught may be very minimal. There have been people who have complained that English has been downplayed by these Latin masters, even though they are technically supposed to teach it.
Headmaster Tisdale, you've had some very famous students that have gone on to be statesmen and also artists and painters and so forth. and I know over the years you've taught them about a lot of these principles. I would like to throw a couple out at you and let you tell me and Steve how that has influenced your students. Cicero is one of the individuals, obviously, that you've shared with your students, and his discussion of moral goodness and holding office. Can you share how you have used Cicero to influence some of your students who are now successful in this new venture in the new country of the United States?
Well, I think that Cicero is probably the most influential of all the ancients. The Roman Republic is seen by just about all educated Republicans, at least in the Western world, as the great example of Republican government. The British system being the other great example. And Cicero is seen as the great defender of that republic. He, after all, was a martyr who died trying to defend the republic against the onslaught of Julius Caesar and people who had ambitions to transform the republic into an empire. He was also a great philosopher and statesman, and so there are a lot of different reasons why Cicero is so admired. Cicero was one of the great defenders of the idea of natural law, the idea that there is a universal system of ethics that all societies at all times adhere to. It is sort of ingrained in our nature, this code of law. He was also the great proponent of mixed government theory, the idea that the government should be structured so as to balance the power of the one, usually some sort of monarch, and the few, the landed aristocrats who own most of the wealth, and finally the majority of propertyless people. And this, of course, the founders incorporated into our Constitution, the president being a very powerful monarch, even though he is limited in term of office, the Senate being designed to house a natural aristocracy of talent, wealth, and virtue, and so on.
If I can interject you, I suppose also that the influence of headmasters like yourself sharing those philosophers affected the Electoral College. They wanted to make sure that the aristocrats could check any possibility of someone being chosen president that wouldn't meet certain standards.
Surely, they did not want the president to be chosen by the people because this presented some historical problems. Men such as Athenian demagogues in ancient Athens, the founders did not look well upon Athenian democracy. They considered it to be a system of mob rule. And so they thought it would be very dangerous if the people chose the monarch, the president. And they do want the majority to play a role, which is why the House of Representatives is directly elected for very short terms. But it should not be the overshadowing role. They should be balanced by a body of the aristocracy and by a monarch.
One other question, and then I'll rotate back to Steve. George Washington was given a lot of credit, Headmaster Tisdale, not too long ago, and the successful revolution and planning military strategy. What have you shared with your students about military leaders and strategies from the Greek and Roman times that was adopted, or is that correct, that were adopted by George Washington?
Well, I think that Washington certainly, from his knowledge of Roman history, which he acquired sort of secondhand from the Fairfaxes, his own education being cut short, but he certainly was very much influenced by the story of Fabius, Quintus Fabius Maximus, the famous Roman general of the 3rd century BC during the Second Punic War, the great war between Rome and Carthage, these two enemies. Fabius was the one who, or one of the Roman generals who foiled Hannibal's invasion of Italy. And the manner in which he did it was basically through what I guess we might call guerrilla warfare. That is, that if you have an enemy who outnumbers you and overpowers you, the answer to it is to avoid open battles and simply to catch him off guard to strike him when he is least prepared. When he sends out a small detachment somewhere, you pounce on that, and gradually deplete his force in this way until he is forced to surrender. And this is, of course, what Fabius did to Hannibal, and Washington was very conscious of that.
Steve Schenk.
In some of the materials that I've reviewed, and also in hearing some of your previous comments, a couple of things have surprised me. I would have thought that Plato or Aristotle might be the great classical thinker who had the largest impact on our founding fathers, not Cicero. And I noticed, again in the material, something that surprised me, and that was the inclusion of Brutus among those people who you believe had an impact. And of course, in my limited historical knowledge, he's most famous for what he did to Caesar. But could you tell us a little bit about how Brutus has influenced the thinking of our founding fathers?
Sure. I think that Brutus was one of several Republican martyrs of the Roman Republic whom the founders admired for their willingness to die for the sake of Roman liberty. Cicero being the greatest example, but Cato the Younger was another, and Brutus and Cassius, the assassins of Caesar. It's sort of the flip side of the coin. The founders really detested Caesar. Caesar and Cromwell are usually put together as these two great dictators, what we might call anti-heroes, and they were just terribly vilified, and so obviously anyone who risked his own life to take that of Caesar's would be someone who would be admired. In the case of Aristotle and Plato, I certainly would not say that they were not influential. They were highly influential, but largely second-hand. The Latin had such a primacy over Greek that they intended to encounter all of these Greek theories through Romans, and particularly Cicero. When you think of Aristotle, you think of mixed government theory, and yet they got that largely from Cicero, who got it from Aristotle, and things like natural law, which go back to Plato and even beyond Plato to the Pythagoreans. The founders didn't get it from Plato and the Pythagoreans, but actually from Cicero. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but in general, they tended to get their Greek theories secondhand from the Romans.
You mentioned Cromwell, and I'm curious. In the late 18th century, when you are teaching, does some of this modern thinking, putting it into a historical context, is that also a part of the studies of your students and of the founding fathers?
There is some English history which is considered to be essential to our historical training, because basically what we are looking at in teaching history to grammar students is the great rise of liberty in the world, which culminates here in the United States. And that is a story that begins in the republics of ancient Greece and Rome, especially Rome, and it is foiled by Caesar and his followers. And we have a great dark age, which really begins not in what some people call the Middle Ages, but really begins earlier with the Roman Empire and continues until very modern times when republicanism has arisen again. And this is another reason, aside from their great wisdom, why we Americans are so attached to Greece and Rome, is because they provided the precedents for us of our great republic. And what we feel is that this is the second round in the battle. In the first round, Cato and Cicero were defeated by Caesar and Augustus. But in the second round, we Americans living in a fertile continent with limitless resources, that we can pack the punch which will win this second and decisive round against tyranny.
Headmaster Nathan Tisdale, I know again, as I said a minute ago, your students have and are influencing this new country and its growth. And one of the things that's been involved since the adoption of the Articles of Confederation and later the Constitution is the fight between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists and the role of a central government versus states. How does that fit into the Greek and Roman classics, and can you identify for your students some individuals in history that would take both of those sides?
Well, I think on the question of federal power, the level of federal power that we should have, the ancients may not be of much use in the sense that the ancients were very much concerned with that their republics be small. Aristotle, I think, even said that citizens should all be able to know each other on sight, that republics should be very small, large enough, he said, to be self-sufficient and to ward off enemies, which ironically the Greek republics were not, which is why they fell, but fairly small. And even the anti-federalists who want the power in the hands of the states rather than the federal government, and who use classical philosophers as their weapons, even they must admit that a republic the size of New York, even in the late 18th century, is far vaster than anything Aristotle would have accepted. So in a sense we are in new waters here, and of course Madison in Federalist number 10 tried to navigate us through those waters, tried to say that in fact this is one area where the ancients were deficient, they were wrong. Larger republics are actually better than smaller republics because they have more interests, and those interests balance each other out. And whereas in a small republic, one interest may take over the others and tyrannize over the other.
So you were saying that your former students and other headmasters' former students, with this great background in the classics, are adding to it that each country and each generation will have some amendments to that process.
Certainly we're not slavish adherents to the classics. In fact, one of the most important things that I think students will get from the classics is this tremendous spirit of independence of thought. After all, if you look back at the ancient Greek and Roman philosophers, they lived in a time in which theories such as popular sovereignty and natural law and mixed government were very unusual. If we look at Egypt or Mesopotamia, these were systems in which the kings ruled absolutely. In the case of Egypt, the Pharaoh even claimed to be a god on earth. So they themselves were great rebels, you might say, the ancient philosophers, and they would certainly not admire anyone who took their theories whole and who did not bring a certain critical aspect to those theories. So I think we can best win the respect of the ancients by questioning them on occasion when they appear to be wrong.
And there was debate between those classical philosophers too. Steve?
Might be interesting to take a minute at this point. Your last conversation started me thinking about the fact that the Republic of the Romans and the Republic of your time, the late 18th century, is dramatically different from the Republic of our time today. The rights of citizenship and the privileges of our democracy have been extended considerably beyond those of yours. And I wonder if you'd tell us a little bit about who makes up a fully enfranchised member of your republic.
Well, the ancients believed that the citizen was a free-born adult male, and that has generally been the definition of a citizen. Obviously, this leaves out a large segment of the population. It leaves out slaves, and of course we here in the late 18th century have slavery just as they did in Greece and Rome. It leaves out women, and it also leaves out children, who are a very large body of the population. And the question of what constitutes a republic or democracy is open to a lot of different definitions. If you define it by direct participation by citizens, however citizens may be termed, then obviously the ancients were much more democratic than we are today because their citizens of Athens actually voted directly on legislation. even though the citizens were only the freeborn adult males. If, on the other hand, your definition of republic or democracy rests on the definition of citizen, having a broad definition, then perhaps we are more, or getting to be at least more democratic today, even though the participation is less, because citizens no longer participate directly. They elect representatives to participate for them.
I know that you have a number of concrete examples, and you touched on Cincinnatus in response to Tony's question, influencing General Washington. Can you give us some other good concrete examples of how the classics influenced the everyday thinking of military leaders and political leaders of your time?
I think that we've mentioned Cicero several times. I think that John Adams consciously modeled himself on Cicero. We find from his very early days he was fascinated by Cicero. He studied his speeches and recited them to himself for purely entertainment purposes. And it may have helped, because Adams was one of the great orators of the 18th century. In fact, when he got up on the floor of the Congress on July 1st, 1776, to argue in favor of American independence, the first thing he stated was that he wished he had the eloquence of Cicero for such an occasion, such an important occasion. And throughout his life, he tried to adhere to Cicero's iron integrity. For instance, he turned down in the 1760s a position as Admiralty Court judge because he considered these juryless British courts unconstitutional. In 1770, he defended the soldiers of the so-called Boston Massacre because he felt they were entitled to a defense, even though it hurt his popularity with the Patriots. When he was president, he made peace with France and foiled his own re-election as a result.
I'm going to have to interrupt. I've got the signal that we're out of time. And on behalf of Steve and our panel, first of all, we want to thank Headmaster Nathan Tisdale for taking us through the late part of the 18th century and how that tied the Greek and Roman philosophers. And if we can come out of that role-playing back to now, we thank Dr. Carl Richard for your appearance here. It's been most informative. Ladies and gentlemen, if you joined us late, we're doing a 12-week series on Journey Through Time, conversations with the world's great women and men. And if you'll be back next week, we'll get into specific personalities. One week we're going to do Galileo, and another week Thomas Jefferson, Susan B. Anthony, and other famous both American and international personalities. We think that you're going to really find this whole series most exciting, as today's program has been. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.